Get started now. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute. This is a very special occasion. Nicholas Canny is one of our most distinguished historians. He's been president of the Royal Irish Academy. He's been vice president of research in NUI Galway, now University of Galway. He's done so many things, European Research Council, Scientific Council. But this is a new book by him, which is always a special occasion because of the particular role that he's had in Irish historiography, in particular about thinking about the early modern period. So I want to welcome everybody today. My first task is to introduce the president of the university, Ciaran, and the president's going to welcome us and say a few words. So Ciaran, over to you.
Thank you very much. Great turnout, I think, and great respect for Nicholas. And we were just saying to Pádraig that it's great to be back doing events such as this. And for me, it's great to be back doing what is very often not what the president gets to do, is the academic work of the university. The work of the president is often to do with other things, management and so on, where this is a particularly privileged occasion for me to come. As those of you who know me will know, Nicholas Canny was a name that was often with me, and I've known for a long time for various reasons as a student here and knowing people who were students of his. And when I was preparing for today, I remembered an interview he gave in History Ireland back in 1998 called Westward Enterprise. And I'm sure the editor at the time, Tommy Graham, knew that this was a very important encapsulation, if you like, of Nicholas's work, because the title, first of all, drew on the edited volume of 1978, one of his early works, but also I think captured also two things, a pun or a play on two elements of what I think are very important about Nicholas's work and his position in the literature. First of all, his positioning of the history of Ireland and Irish history in an international context. So the sense that there was more at play here in Ireland than simply matters Irish, matters of Ireland. And I think his work, including the work that we're thinking about today, has been very much in that sense of seeing Irish history as part of a much broader picture, and that westward sense of the British expansion, if you like. And then secondly, capturing what is also sometimes seen as a tension, but not really so, is that international perspective, that broader perspective with the local sense of itself. And Nicholas being of this parish, both where he grew up in the west of Ireland, where he studied as a student and then went to the States to do a PhD, the title also captured that. And in that, one of the things he talks about, there's a great, to draw on Richard Evans' title, there's a great defense of history. So he's asked in the book, why is history in decline, or in the interview, and he mentions, first of all, the decline in school, in history and teaching of history at school, but he also has some, I think, what are actually controversial and characteristically interesting things to say, and I think it's important to note in this context. He says to write a good history book takes 10 to 15 years of laborious labor in the archives, plus the writing up time. And he then says, those who want the instant comment don't have time for this. They don't have time to wait for the mature statement to be brought to fruition, and neither do they have time for reading the long book, which relies on reference to documentary evidence to support the argument. They want the book which has a sharply focused argument with immediate relevance, quote unquote, to the present, and which draws lessons, quote unquote, from the past out of immediate application. In that sense, the property of the past has been taken over by people in other disciplines. How we as historians should be addressing that is probably for a debate in which we have not seriously engaged. And I think that defense of history, that recapturing of history, I think is a particularly important aspect of Nicholas's work, which is reflected here today too. And thinking about that work, I was also drawn then to the face shrift, which was issued or edited by Brady McCourta. And I'm sure it's difficult or interesting for or odd for Nicholas to be in the place where we're talking about him, but Breen, I think, captures it very nicely, Nicholas's work and contribution, having again been a student of his. And if you indulge me, I'll just read a paragraph of it. because I think it captures it perfectly. Intrepid and hardworking, he has brought the pioneering spirit to manifold historical endeavours. Diligent in pursuit of fresh sources, as he is again in this context, attentive to the neglected potential of Gaelic material. His work has also been characterised by wide acquaintance with historiographical trends for the early modern period on the continent and the United States as well as in these islands, and again capturing that sense of this particular volume. This reading has issued in a steady stream of book reviews over the years. Fellowships and academic centres abroad, including several in the United States as well as in Britain and the Netherlands, reflect his commitment to writing to the exchange of ideas within the transnational historical community. This outlook has contributed greatly to making the study of early modern Ireland a part of the wider historiographical mainstream. Breadth of vision and commitment to international standards have enriched his students. Regular office hours ensure that he is readily accessible. Written material is promptly read, incisively commented on and returned. Seminars presented undergraduates with enticing possibilities to engage with the forefront of research. Lectures are vibrant and inspiring. Conscientious in attending to teaching and supervising responsibilities, including the Galway University's commitment to offering courses through Irish, he's been a generous mentor to many. As a lecturer, supervisor, colleague, department head, director of the Moore Institute, University Vice President and President of the Royal Irish Academy, he has tirelessly encouraged the pursuit of excellence and fostered bold vision and serious application among those in his charge. And I think if we take that as a paragraph emblematic of Nicholas's contribution, I think there's a lesson in it for us all about commitment to research, to teaching, to students, but also particularly importantly to leadership. And this, in the introduction of this work, Nicholas talks about the interruption sometimes leadership is in the context of research and writing. But Nicholas, I think the contribution that from the humanities are often lost to leadership, I think has been particularly significant, as mentioned here, as we know ourselves, both at this university more broadly. And Dan carries that forward with his current chairmanship of the IRC, but it's particularly important, I think, that colleagues from the humanities are called to leadership. And we have only 2 vice presidents for research currently in Ireland who have a humanities background, one being here and one being recently appointed at DCU. Nicholas was one of those early ones and one of those rare ones as well. And I think there's that sense in which very often we cede ground if we don't also come into leadership as a discipline. And I think Nicholas has again been important in that regard. And I'll finish then by that sense of sustaining a tradition, because I mentioned that many people that I knew Nicholas and spoke of him with great respect and reverence. And in the interview with History Ireland, he mentions 2 particular influences on himself: Gerard Hayes McCoy and David Quinn. And it's very interesting that people who are then become part of a tradition and that carry on a tradition of excellence and carry on a tradition of a discipline and creating and supporting and sustaining a discipline are remembered years afterwards. And I think when other future historians are interviewed in future, many of whom appeared in the face shirt, many of whom are with us today, I have no doubt that they will also mention that there was a man in Galway called Nicholas Canny, who was also formative to their research and who were influential in bringing them into history and sustaining their history, as Hayes McCoy and David Quinn. Gerard Hayes McCoy and David Quinn were to Nicholas himself. And that to me is the most important part of what we talk about sustaining a discipline, is that sense that we have a tradition that we have formed, and we have shaped, but we have also innovated in, and Nicholas has. So for that reason, I'm particularly pleased to be here today. I'm asked to do many things, and this was one I was particularly keen to take part in, because both personally as myself, my connections and relationships I've had in the past, and as the university president, I'm particularly pleased to be here to recognise yet another monumental, excellent, high standard piece of work by Nicholas, and to be part of the audience at this seminar. So, I was Tracy.
Much, Ciaran, and that signaling of tradition is actually a nice moment of transition as we start to convene our panel discussion on the book itself. Our chair of the session is Professor Enrico Lago, who is actually a successor to Nicholas Canny and Steve Ellis in the role of established chair of history at the University of Galway. So it's really handing over to Enrico and very much looking forward to the comments of our panel. So Enrico.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks to everybody for coming to this wonderful occasion celebrating Nicholas. Fundamentally, what I'm going to do is going to be introduce briefly our panelists, and then I will ask them to speak in order for a few minutes before we open the discussion to the audience. So I start with Pádraig. Pádraig Lenihan lectures history here at the University of Galway. Before becoming an academic, he served in the Irish Army for 14 years, retiring at the rank of captain. The study of Irish, British, and continental warfare in the period 1614-1715 forms the backbone of his research, though he has always written a well-received survey of Irish history, consolidating Conquest Ireland 1603-1727, and a scholarly biography of a controversial figure, the last Cavalier, Richard Talbot. Bernadette Cunningham is recently retired from the Royal Irish Academy Library. She's a graduate of the University of Galway, where she was one of Professor Nicholas Canny's first research students. She is author of several books on early modern Irish history, including The World of Geoffrey Keating, The Annals of the Four Masters, and her most recent book is Medieval Irish Pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela. Marc Caball is Associate Professor at UCD School of History. He works on the cultural history of early modern Gaelic Ireland and the history of the British Atlantic world. He's currently writing a global microhistory centered on an Anglo-Irish family in early 18th century Ireland and India. He's also preparing the Historic Town Atlas for Tralee for the Royal Irish Academy's Irish Historic Town Atlas series. He's co-director of the UCD College of Arts and Humanities Research Strand in Digital Cultures. Marie-Louise Coolahan is a personal professor in English at the University of Galway here. She is the author of Women, Writing and Language in Early Modern Ireland. She has published in journals such as the 17th Century, Criticism, Critical Quarterly, Huntington Library Quarterly, Early Modern Women and Women's Writing. She is the principal investigator of RESIRC, funded by the European Research Council. Her most recent publications are in the special issue of Irish Historical Studies, a new agenda for women's and gender history in Ireland, and in the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Women's Writing in English. Ciaran Brady is Emeritus Professor of Early Modern History and Historiography at Trinity College Dublin. He's a specialist in early modern Irish history. He developed a subsequent interest in Irish historiography and on the problems of history writing in general, an interest which resulted, among other publications, in his studies of James Anthony Freud, an intellectual biography of a Victorian prophet. So now I'm going to ask the panelists to speak in order, starting with Pádraig. I would really ask you to please speak for 5, maximum 6 minutes. And we'll be strict.
As much as 5.
He means all the panelists, not just me. There are 3 traumas in the 17th century: the plantation of Ulster, 1641 massacre, and the Cromwellian settlement. And you can put your qualifier. Nicholas is writing about the writing of history of those events, how subsequent historians on those 3 levels over 3 centuries reflect on and use those events for their current political agenda. So it's an extraordinary work of a lifetime's study, a lifetime's reading and mature reflection on events. And it's a great achievement to him. There's, if you like, there's 2 streams or rivers. I'm going to pursue this riparian analogy: Protestant history, Catholic history, and in between a lot of confluences and tributaries and distributaries and bog holes and stagnant. But those 2 streams, he traces them in a very interesting fashion. For me, in the Catholic stream, the Young Irelanders, how do you come up with a unitary, inclusive Irish history for Protestant and Catholic? And he explains how they failed to do so. They tried, and the sticking point, as I read it, he probably correct me, was the plantation of Ulster. Mitchell, one of the Young Irelanders, thought, it's like Bismarck's remark about making sausages. It was an unpleasant process at the beginning, but the outcome was okay in the end. We had a new race, people like himself, and the others, McNevin and people like that, had difficulties there. And he brings the story, the nationalist story. He ends with Cusack's History of Ireland, which I'm delighted to see the illustrated history, and is reflected in the title. That gets due prominence. And she brings in the essential story arc of Irish history. I keep looking at my watch here, which is failure, failure, failure. You keep losing, but you keep coming back. Personally, I would have pulled the nationalist story forward to Mary Hayden and Moonan, which she has some interesting things to say. The story, her story, she moves on from the 1641 rising to the extent of accepting that there was a massacre, something that previous Catholic historians not only fudge but deny, to say they started it with the Island McGee massacre. The Protestant stream he looks at as well. And again, my reading of it was, if you look at Froude, for example, and James Anthony Froude, it's a kind of a dead end sort of way of looking at it. For him, the 1641, what happened or is supposed to happen, is the touchstone, it's the litmus test. It forever fixes how people respond to the majority community in Ireland and the sort of rights they can enjoy and their political claims. And he does so with a racialist tinge. Ciaran may correct him, may come in this. I mean, the right of a people to self-government, and I'm quoting from Nicholas's book, consists and can consist in nothing but their power to defend themselves. In other words, if you're conquered, ipso facto, you're inferior. That's it. Therefore, the Irish are forever inferior, and that therefore they make very good subordinates. They understand and respect firm leadership, but they have done nothing which posterity will not be anxious to forget. The point I'm making here is that, as Nicholas explains it, that tradition is something of it's not as self-reflective or as introspective, perhaps, as the nationalist tradition pretends to be or is. And finally, those words, so we're nearly there. Again, I would have protracted it up to Cyril Falls, the Birth of Ulster, which I think is very much in that tradition. He uses adverbs and adjectives cleverly, but he's still got an essentially very a view of the plantation, that it was a thoroughly good thing, that there were no victims, nobody was hurt in the process, and that the natives were a shiftless lot, the lower orders benefited from it, and so on. So, I mean, those would be not quibbles so much as points maybe that people might pick up on in discussion. But what can I say? Thank you.
Thanks, Pádraig. A model of timekeeping and the terrorizing tactic work. So Bernadette is next.
Thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. The strands, Pádraig mentioned that there are numerous strands in Irish historiography, and the one that I want to pick up on, and one that Nicholas has done his best to give prominence to throughout this macro history of Irish historiography, is the Irish language writing and the use of Irish language sources, because even down to the present day, there's always a kind of a guilt among those who don't use Irish language sources, and a kind of ambivalence towards whether they're actually of value or not. Now, the various chapters in Imagining Ireland's Past focus predominantly on English language writing. The people who had the patronage, the money, the support, the access to print through the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. And when a historian like Nicholas wants to give equivalence to Irish language writing or equivalent to Catholic writing, although those two are not exactly equivalent, you become aware always that there is a mismatch, that there's a sense of inferiority among the Catholic historians that are always on the defensive. So you've got the arrogance of a lot of English language writing in the 18th century in particular, and a defensiveness among the Irish language writers. So how do we deal with that lack of equivalence is an ongoing issue. But what really came home to me in reading this book is that the reality of that lack of equivalence for 18th century historians when they were trying to write, they were living with this second-class citizen feeling every day, and that inevitably informed their writing. Whereas a lot of those writing in English were writing from a serious sense of superiority and a great belief that just making the Irish more English was the solution to their problems. The problem then comes when we as historians go into the libraries and archives and are confronted with authoritative books in print and the manuscript material that we also realize that we have to look at. And our worlds are confined by what's available in the archives, obviously, but the question that we have to ask is if those large volumes, like I'm thinking of something now like the edited letters of Ulick Burke, the Marquess of Clanrickard, who was active in the 1640s. A century later, one of his descendants decided to edit the books just to promote the image of the Burkes and the image of the Clanrickard Burkes through the centuries. And it's a huge tome, right? A huge folio volume. And it has an authority just because of its physical presence in a library that other things don't. But if you look at the recent work of people like Vincent Morley, who again works with 18th century Irish language sources and did an analysis, for example, of that historical poem, Turf na Héireann, and tried to measure the impact of that poem through the 18th and 19th centuries. So some of you will be aware of that kind of work. And then if you also look at Toby Barnard's study of print through the 18th century in his recent book called Brought to Book, it's called Print in Ireland 1680 to 1784. His conclusion, having gone over a selection of the material that Nicholas would also deal with for the 18th century, Toby concludes that people's engagement with and understanding of the past was shaped more by legend, by local interests and connections, by travel, and by present circumstances, their own present circumstances, than they were by any encounter with the printed word. So when we as historians toddle off to the archives, are we really getting a sense of what the past was like? One final point, if I have a minute to go, is the ambivalence you find in the English language sources about Irish language material. And this starts, one of the earliest examples I would have would be Sir Richard Cox, who publishes his History of Ireland from the Normans to the 1650s in 1689-90. He's writing in Bristol because he's gone there really to further his legal career, but also because he didn't feel safe in Ireland in the late 1680s as a Protestant legal specialist. So he writes his history, which is decidedly sectarian, decidedly anti-Irish, but then at the end, he comes along and says, well, when I talk about the Irish, I don't mean all the Irish, I just mean the rebel Irish. Because it had dawned on him in Bristol, obviously. If you're Irish, born in Cork, go to Bristol, you suddenly realize you're Irish, you're not English, right? So he has that sense of a dual identity himself. But when he comes to write about Keating, his most famous line that Keating's history written in the 1630s about pre-Norman Ireland is an ill-digested heap of very silly fictions. Right? But yet he cites Keating as a historical source. So there's ambivalence, there's suspicion, but there's also curiosity about the Irish past. And you get the same thing a century later in Edward Ledwich's 2-volume antiquarian work, The Antiquities of Ireland, published in 1790. He says he's just getting tired of the numerous defenders of our bardic fictions. And he wishes people wouldn't keep on citing the Book of Invasions, the Book of Ballymote, the Book of Leck, and all these great medieval texts and sources. He says people who do that kind of thing can expect few readers and fewer admirers. So Ledwich advised that if you want to write about the Irish past, you're much better off citing William Camden or Edmund Spencer because they really understand medieval Ireland. But yet he goes back and he says that Keating lacks critical discrimination, but yet it is a curious work and the lack of it would have been a loss to Irish literature. So that ambivalence is there in the late 17th century, it's there in the late 18th century, and it's still there today in terms of the kind of sources that historians use. I think Nicholas has done a very good job in trying to knit the Irish language sources into the book, but there's still a certain mismatch that really I don't think we can ever quite overcome. Thank you.
Bernadette, maybe overdid it with the terrorizing tactic. Mark, you're next.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan, for the invitation to come to Galway. It's always a pleasure. This is a very rich book. It's like an ecology. It's like a very rich Christmas dinner. I mean, you can only take a little bit at any given time. I want to focus on something that struck me as hugely stimulating for me and made me look at a topic that I thought was kind of dull and antiquarian and Victorian and fusty, and that's the local histories, particularly local histories composed by unionist authors, and one particularly by a very extraordinary and rather fearsome lady called Miss Hickson. We'll just leave it at Miss Hickson. Generally, well, she liked to say Miss Hickson. You don't see Mary much. She's not a Mary type woman. Anyway, in the 19th century, I think this is not just a sort of an antiquarian niche topic. There's this extraordinary sense, it seems to me, on the part of rural Protestant unionist communities being under cultural siege. It's really, really very reminiscent of the situation in the north of Ireland today, Northern Ireland, whatever you call it, the 6 counties, whatever lights your fire. They're under siege in this country: Catholic emancipation, loss of control over local government, the disestablishment of the church in 1869. And they're sensing, unionists are sensing that the challenge of writing history from a nationalist perspective, which is dealt with so well in Nicholas's book. They go back to what are perceived as the injustices of plantations, and Nicholas brings this out extremely well. So the plantations and land seem to, and religion are constant themes in this book. But local history, I think, and I think, Nicholas, this is what you would argue, gave these individuals a space, literally a physical and conceptual space in which to anchor their identities in an Ireland which is changing very rapidly. And it seems to me that local history perhaps has been overlooked to some extent, or perhaps a sort of condescending attitude on the part of professional historians to local history. And I thought I'd just say a few words about Mary Hickson, Miss Hickson, Mary Agnes Hickson, 1825.
You say Mary.
There's a movie called Mary, isn't there? 1899. Anyway, she's truly born solicitor, father, an antiquarian. She's much influenced by a local clergyman called Arthur Rowan. She never actually wrote a history of the county of Kerry, but she put together 2 really interesting books, selections from old Kerry records, 1872 and 1874. She's probably best known to historians as editor, author of the, she's kind of a one-woman ERC research project for the 1641 depositions in Trinity. She spent the summer there. You say her research summer. I mean, she did extraordinary work. I mean, when you look at the wonderful stuff that you managed to achieve in Trinity, but that was a team, right? A research team. How this woman, who was of quite limited means, a spinster, how she managed to do it, I don't quite know. But what Nicholas has done, I think he has disinterred this woman, who's extraordinarily interesting. And Nicholas shows us that Hickson set out to demonstrate that Protestant landowners in Kerry, and by implication elsewhere, were not of Cromwellian provenance. She aims to rehabilitate them. She argued that none of these families were, and she was a terrible snob, were of mean or mechanical background. And she emphasized that many of these families intermarried and intermixed with Gaelic families, with Anglo-Norman families. So this isn't this kind of intrusive, aggressive invasion. This is a kind of a developing social ecology. And again, Nicholas, I think he works through the material with incredible concision, and you have to kind of go back to see just some of the nuance you bring out in her work. Hickson argued that Kerry Protestant families had remained loyal to the crown and that they had combined with Catholic families for the same purpose. And there are all these little details that I find quite interesting. For instance, Nicholas, you bring out the influence of a very obscure work, William Maziere Brady's McGillicuddy Papers, 1867. Most people will not have heard of it. And there she picked up this notion that early modern history in Kerry in particular and parts of Munster was characterized by continuity. So it's not characterized by these kind of disruptions. Again, she makes the case that the elite was religiously tolerant. And then Nicholas draws out this. He begins to, he moves on to explore other unionist local historians. I don't have time to talk about them, but he makes the case that Hickson influenced the likes of W.G. Martin, who wrote a history of Sligo to 1882, 1889, 1892, James Frost, the history of County Clare, 1893, and the Reverend George Hill, who a librarian at Queen's, produced several sort of works and collected primary sources. I thought I'd just finish up with a kind of reflection. Early modern history, we're told, it's not terribly, doesn't appeal to students. It's kind of not hitting where we need to hit intellectually and culturally. I just want, this book made me stand back and think about, well, why are we doing early modern Irish history? Why do we do early modern history full stop? And it just struck me that there's so many contemporary resonances coming out of Nicholas's work. I went to look at the Kerry Evening Post for the 8th of April, 1899, and we were told the death of Miss Hickson at Kingston College, Mitchelstown, a lady distinguished for her learned writings and her researches into the past of her native county. The county of Kerry is noted for producing clever men and women, but few could see the talents of Miss Hickson. She attained the age of 73 years, but was in failing health for some time. Now, I don't know if you've been listening to the news recently, but Kingston College has been in the news. I know this may go from the ridiculous to sublime. Kingston College, Professor Canny, Miss Hickson, and DIY SOS. Well, 6 of these Church of Ireland almshouses have been renovated. And the presenter gave an interview recently to one of the national papers saying that he feared, Baz, that a them and us attitude might emerge in respect to refugees and asylum seekers. And I've been increasingly intrigued by this notion of plantations. The extreme right are using the notion of the plantation, new plantations in Ireland, great replacement theory and all of that. There's a very good piece on this appropriation of plantation by the far right, by James Park of DC on the RTE website for the 13th of December. And there's the sense that the use of the term plantation by far-right groups in Ireland is a localized effort to peddle misinformation and racism. Has history come full circle? Miss Hickson dies in Kingston College, and now Kingston College is revamped to face a whole new range of challenges demographically. I'll leave it at that. Gawn buchas leat Nicholas Canny as an leir starre tábhachtach seo chur fág do starthe de bhí léin agus de léthóirí star na hÉireann. The Annalise fios bragúil chur her fáge mar gheall le léamh na starre agus an nasc I de ríogus an folatíocht batha agus slánta.
Thanks, Mark. Next is Marie-Louise.
Great, thank you. I've come at this book a few times. This is the actual book. I've come at it a few times, and the first time I have to say, I also thanked Nicholas in my mind's eye because he had conveniently for readers put in a short introduction and conclusion to every single chapter so that people are staying with him. And my first time, of course, I was under time pressure, as so many of us are. And I thought, thanks, Nicholas. Don't have to bother with the rest of it. Great. However, I am here to tell you, having since come back at it a couple of times, that those conclusions really don't come into their own. They're so enriched by reading what are actually incredibly, I think you said, Bernadette, a macro history of Irish historiography is the way you put it. But it's done with such finesse and such elegance that actually the richness of each section, the key points come across in a really clear way. And you then get to the conclusions, go, now I really see what he was getting at in the conclusion rather than the speed reading version. But for me, the real gift of this book is the joining of the dots. I suppose as a scholar who works on literature and is located in literature rather than history, a lot of these works I would have come at as isolated works on their own. And it comes back to that question of the macro history thing again. The way in which Nicholas kind of slots those works that I would know some of them very, very well on their own into a wider context is really kind of phenomenal, I've got to say. The kind of the picture he has of the intellectual historiographical milieu is so finely grained. And I want to give you one example. He talks in one of the early chapters about Edmund Campion, who was an English Catholic who was invited over to Ireland, invited to write a history of Ireland in 1570, 1571. And when Henry Sidney, the then English Lord Deputy, when it came to his attention that Campion was going to be arrested for being a recusant, he felt that it was sufficiently tolerationist of himself to warn him and to say, get yourself out of here, you're going to be arrested. Yet only 6 years later, when Sidney came back for his second term as Lord Deputy, and Campion's friend Richard Stanihurst was revising that history. So this is just 6 years later. It became clear that the Lord Deputy now countenanced a very hardline approach. What both Campion and Stanihurst were trying to do was give a sense in which the old English, the English of the Pale, the people who've been there since the 12th century, were okay for the new English regime. They should be included in the government. And in the space of 6 years, Henry Sidney had gone from being quite open to that opinion to being absolutely, completely not prepared to take it. By comparison, we might think we have the university president here. His term is a 10-year term. So in 6 years for things to change, we hope, Ciaran, you won't be changing things so much within a 6-year frame. For me, the point is that the context in which Nicholas puts this writing is so finely attuned to, you know, the kinds of shift that can happen within 6 years. His sense of the changing dynamics, the historical moment, really, I think, jumps out at me in a way that had never really struck me before. And it's maybe a danger that we have when we're looking at historical periods. We call it a period. We forget very easily how quickly people's opinions and ideas can change in the space of 6 years. Another thing, I suppose, that I'd like to think about is the beautiful turns of phrase we get. So not only does Nicholas bring this to our attention, but he does it in a, like I say, a really elegant way. For example, there's a chapter on the exiles, Catholic exiles on the continent, who have to start counteracting the kind of English language histories and thinks about ways of doing it. And he puts that in the context of a number of things. But one of the things that really struck me is not actually just the context, it's the way he puts it. For these Catholic exiles, he says, when they arrive on the continent, mainly Spain, quote, for them, as for their Protestant counterparts, defeat was success postponed. And I think that's going to be my motto of the year. I'm going to put it beside my, so you plumb the book for mottos, for ways to live your life. Now where I am, where am I time-wise? Do you have a couple of minutes? Another kind of just example of that kind of meeting of just the finely grained context that we get is a writer like Philip O'Sullivan Bear, who was a Munster Gaelic Irishman. He went into exile to Spain. His most famous work is written in Latin, and it's a Catholic counter-narrative. And I've only ever studied that kind of on its own. I see it as a very isolated work. And what Nicholas does in that, the relevant chapter here, is he acknowledges, yeah, in a lot of ways, this is an isolated work. He wasn't a clergyman. Many of the people writing these histories were clergymen. O'Sullivan Bear wasn't. He was somebody who, you know, had very serious skin in the game. Their lands back in Munster had been taken away from them. But he puts it in the context, not just of the Catholic clergymen who were writing histories in Europe who were Irish, But in the context of the kinds of continental histories that were being written by Catholics trying to counter Protestant narratives, full stop. So across Europe, all kinds of Catholic historians were writing confessional histories to try and counter the version of history that the Protestants were proposing with the Reformation at its highest point. And just looking at Sullivan Bear in the context of all of that really made me transform the way that I think about Sullivan Bear, I have to say. So just to finish up, the finally word, my vision for this was that it would be a panel for discussion. So I was trying to think about questions we could ask Nicholas. So my question might be to think through questions of genre. There's a few examples here, Spencer's view, about which, of course, Nicholas has written so authoritatively for such a long period, and he masterfully limits himself to 2 pages in the book. So we might ask him how he managed to restrain himself. But he does mention here that the view is not classically a history, and he explains that it's included here because it's similar to the apocalyptic histories that he's talking about, in using the past and scripture to divine the ways in which God would permit punishment to fall on those who had failed to complete the Reformation of Ireland. That's one example. We have David Roth's Analecta, which is acknowledged to be a mixed genre. You say it could be a political discourse, a theological polemic, a Catholic martyrology, but you say a historical narrative underpins the entire text. We have the 1641, we have pamphlets and depositions, as well as verse histories. I'd love to hear you thinking about the verse history as a form of history writing. Spot the English lit person who wants to use that genre. And also John Bale's vocation, which I love personally, and I've written about as being life writing, as being autobiography rather than history. So I'll just finish maybe with that question to throw out about genre and history writing, especially, of course, I'm focusing on the 16th and 17th centuries when the genre is in, as we know, it is in formation. So there's a lot of leeway there, but I would love to hear Nicholas talk about his decisions around that. Thanks.
Wonderful. You spoke exactly for 5 minutes. Your turn.
I will not speak for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I hope the 5 minutes is counting down from now. First thing I want to say is that Nicholas has been one of a generation of historians that used critically comparative history. I think it was hugely important. Irish history generally, and early modern history and medieval history in particular, was without comparative perspective. And one of the great things that Nicholas, you'll agree, you're not the only one doing this, David Quinn and others were doing, put Irish history, late medieval history, Stephen Ellis is here and doing this in comparison as well, into a broader comparative perspective. One of the great things that happened in the late 20th century and early 21st century was the changing of Irish history from the history of, what was happening in the conquest to what was happening elsewhere. With you, Nicholas and David, and with you, Stephen, one was looking outward toward the West and looking toward Britain or England in the East. And that was a hugely important shift in perspective from not so much a nationalist history, but an introvert history. And I think that was wonderful. And I think both Stephen and Nicholas, Brendan Bradshaw, and myself have acknowledged that to other historians who woke us up to this. And by the way, it wasn't English historians who did that by and large. It was Irish historians who woke us up to this. That is to say that there were broader things. And David Quinn is, of course, I think we all acknowledge as the great figure of that. Second thing I want to say, Nicholas, is your application of comparative history, which was great. Now, we all know how dangerous comparative history is, at just saying one thing is the same as the other. What's happening in Slovenia and what's happening in Belgium means that what's happening in Connemara is the same thing. And no, and yet it is hugely enlightening thing as long as one is critical of the distinctions and indeed what the sources are. And again, one of the things I've been delighted with is in the generation that I've worked with is the huge respect for primary sources. That, you know, you can't say that what happens in the chancellery in Vienna is the same thing that happens in the records office in England, because they have different things, and certainly different what's going on in Salamanca. And one of the great things, and you have drawn our attention to this all the time, is that sources are A, fundamentally important, and B, deeply difficult. You cannot compare one source to another. The second thing I want to say, Nicholas, is the way in which your generosity, right? You're a very argumentative historian. One of the things about a comedian is to know how to pause. But never a vicious or negative historian. You put stuff, you have stimulated argument across. I'll get to the book, by the way, in a minute. You've stimulated argument across the early modern period in so many ways, from the late 15th century, the late 17th century, even into the 18th century, and done so without, and by the way, with reference to the late 18th century, without any of the somewhat rebarbative debates that Gaeilgeoir scholars have done. And one of the things I think that is remarkable about you, Nicholas, is having engaged with people who, Mark, you will know this, who know the difference between the gerund and the gerundive, and destroy reputations on that basis. Never done that. And it has been a huge contribution to cultural debate. I think what you've done in the book is, and here's two words that I've never really quite understood the distinction, but I've masterly and masterful. It is masterful in the sense of the huge command over material that you've managed to convey. And anyone, by the way, if you never want to read the book, just read the footnotes and you'll learn a great deal in them, but masterly in the competence and in the control. How you balanced about one thing. And I read this over and I'm wondering, well, how's Nicholas going to go way on this? Who's going to win that? But balance has been so adjudged and assured. And in that sense, I think the book, all the way through, is an introduction, by the way, at a very high level to people who want to understand Irish history. It's not what I would give to undergraduates, but it's what I would give to somebody who really wants to know how it is Irish history writing has developed. There's a second and third thing. I think this is the third point. You say, and you've always been generous about opening. A minute. Sorry, I thought I was too slow. But the third thing I want to say is this: generous about how things will go forth. Your analysis is a history of ideas. It isn't a history of texts. And there are two things which I think you said have been open to people which they will follow from you. And there are two things. I'm sorry, Enrico, I'm going to run over for just a minute. And the two things are, first, an understanding of genre. An understanding of, but people were writing in the 17th century is not what people were writing history in the 19th century. Or in the 20th century, not least the horrible professionalism of the 20th and 21st century. And the second is textuality of how words go. I'll remind you of what Pocock and Skinner and John Donne have done about language in history writing. And there's a huge possibility of a revolutionary understanding of how Irish history writing could be done if we took those things into account. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Ciaran. We don't have a huge amount for time and discussion. Thanks to you. I first want to ask Nicholas if he wants to respond to any of these comments before opening to the audience.
I suppose I should make a general statement. First of all, thank you very much. And I'm afraid what you have said was more about me than about the book that I have written. So much of it is very embarrassing. But for a start, to deal with Marie-Louise for a start, Edmund Spencer gets very little space because I'm doing an edition of Spencer's View of the State of Ireland.
You're wrong, Nicholas.
When that appears. But yes, there are historical elements within the view of the State of Ireland, but it's not primarily history, it's not really set out to do. So insofar as there is genre is quite true, but insofar as there's something in common with all of these texts, it is that a motivation for historians everywhere and in almost every century is to know where we came from. In other words, origin myth is what drives us. The problem is that defining who the we is. And the current debate in the United States, and it's happening in other countries, but in the United States last week in Philadelphia at the American Historical Association, they almost tore themselves apart deciding who we is, because the president of the American Historical Association, a man called Sweet, who's at the University of Wisconsin, published a paper called Is History History? Effectively saying that the concern among historians to write a counter-narrative to the standard narrative, in other words, to have inclusivity within it, because in the definition of the we, almost necessarily you exclude people from it. Starting with the 1619 project in America, the we who had to be included were Black people, and because the first slaves came to America in 1619, and those who took that position wanted to rewrite the history of the United States from start to finish, identifying the leaders of the American Revolution as being slave holders, as well as the other virtuous things that they did, leading to a very acrimonious debate in the United States, which extended over into the political sphere. And that Sweet, who was a historian of Africa, wanted to temper the arguments that were taking place, and in the course of doing so, the House fell on himself, because effectively he was addressing the question of please take it easy, don't seek to include everybody, and think about the past as an antiquarian past, and you must try and understand it on its own terms. So to some degree, as I reread this in the last couple of days and thought about what was happening to Sweet, effectively the same was happening in Irish historiography as has been happening in historiography in the United States, except the debate isn't as bitter quite at the moment. But nonetheless, the question of people being excluded and the requirement to include people. And how do you include people? Insofar as in recent years, historians have become more inclusive, they have been successful in addressing the deficit of women from history. Women, and I think urban and to some degree rural poor have been included in recent history writing in a way that they hadn't been before. Most of the books that I deal with going through this is dealing with high politics, and women hardly feature at all. And even when you have women historians, they don't really write about women. They're writing, insofar as women are mentioned at all, it is in the Cusack book, in that she laments the extent to which women in schools were not being taught history, and she wants to have this matter remedied. But other than that, it's all about men. So that in that sense, there has been an improvement in that scale. But the other success is, insofar as you want to change things, you have to change the grand narrative, which is what they attempted to do in the United States, and which has been attempted in the United Kingdom also, and Britain at least, in that they are now trying to rewrite the history of empire and take more account of the injustices that took place, break down statues, etc., much as was happening in the United States. Insofar as the grand narrative issue was addressed in Ireland, yes, historians of my generation did want to write more in comparative terms, taking issues like the famine not being exclusively an Irish phenomenon, as treating the Irish famine in a comparative context, comparing with other famines. While historians began to operate in this way, become more comparative, that didn't necessarily meet with the requirements of academics and other disciplines, particularly in literature. They wanted the grand narrative, particularly those in Irish language areas, because they wanted to use their sources to sustain a grand narrative. But equally well, television history doesn't lend itself to subtlety or argumentation. And that if you take somebody like Simon Schama, who has written some of the most sophisticated history that has been written in the last 50 years, he has been doing a television series in the history of England, which could have been written 50 years ago by somebody who went to secondary school. You know, it's kind of straight narrative, one after the other, with no subtleties and nothing come in at all. So in that sense, the effort to become more inclusive in historiography, to some degree, that has failed in Ireland as well. And as the book concludes, the second last chapter, I think, it deals primarily with unionists who are sympathetic to the nationalist cause, and unionists who wanted to see themselves as Irish, and who found that the nationalist historians, particularly the Catholic nationalist historians, were denying them the description of Irish because they didn't happen to be Catholic, because Catholic was now the label for inclusivity at this particular juncture. And you know, this was a matter of disturbance, as well as the fact that they were politically conservative and they were objecting to the political changes that were taking place at the time. But we now find the phenomenon in Ireland of those of unionist persuasion, particularly in Northern Ireland, describing themselves as British, despite the fact that they were born in Ireland, despite the fact that when they go to England, they sound and are perceived in England to behaving like Irish people. In that sense, they're stereotypical Irish. But what is to be done to include such people within historiography, or are they going to develop an Ulster historiography of their own? I think this is probably one of the biggest issues that we face. This issue of inclusivity, going back to relate to what's happening in other countries. This is the inclusivity as far as Ireland is concerned. So thank you all for your observations, and sorry for not answering your question.
And now we have the luxury of 9 minutes for this. So there to be did you have a question there?
Kick things off with a question, and I don't know who this is for. Any of the panelists, or indeed Nicholas, and about the publishing history side of this, and that might be a little bit more as we enter the say the 20th century. But the choice of publisher, the venue of where people have gone. There are obviously various Irish outlets, but Oxford and Cambridge still very significant. Jane is here, who's been an editor of a major series for Cambridge. how has that inflected the writing or the prestige associated with certain kinds of publication? This is an OEP publication. I don't know if there's any coherent narrative that we can rescue from that about where Irish history is placed.
Where it's placed now as opposed to.
I suppose, yeah. I mean, it's hard to, and we can't really speak sensibly about the 19th century, I suppose, in terms of publication.
And it's also a question of where Irish culture is placed. It's not just Irish history, it's about Irish literature or art history or Irish philosophy and so on. So big, important question. I don't have an answer to it, but I am saying that.
The choice of location of the path that given authors says as much really about there, for instance, that you point out, that never occurred to me, that Hickson chooses London first. Very local history, which, you know, why not Cork or Dublin? She's obviously appealing to a larger kind of imperial audience or readership, isn't she? So I wonder if the choice of location goes back to the actual.
No, I don't think it's about author. I think it's well, the publications are, I mean, say UCD Press, Four Courts Press, or Irish Academic Press, are things which are great and have produced fantastic products in this thing. But there is a huge problem about this because there's a narrow tunnel into CUP or OUP. And I think you've raised a really important question about this. And I think we have to think more about Irish university presses. And UCD Press is doing it really well and doing it critically well.
But it's also about careers and universities and universities demand.
Yes.
Academics and where they should publish.
Yeah.
Seems to me that Irish publishers are, if we're talking about the contemporary situation, are at a disadvantage.
Thank you. Steve wants to answer.
Yes, I thoroughly enjoyed this book and I learned an awful lot from it. It also took me back to the mid-1970s when I first came to Galway from Manchester via Belfast at the time. And one of the things that we did in Manchester for undergraduates was have this history of history course. And there was basically no teaching for it, but you were told to read up on various different books and articles and so on. And I thought when I came to Galway, we had 5 members of staff at the time, and we taught vast long periods. And we taught them through both languages, and everybody was a specialist in Irish history and tried to do something else besides. So my idea, which I put forward to the department, was that we should offer one of these history of history courses in Galway the same way, because I thought this will give us an opportunity to relinquish some of the teaching and concentrate better on things that we were actually good at. And Nicholas responded to that by saying, well, good in principle, but this is going to be far and away too difficult for the students to understand. Now, if I'd realized at the time, from having read Nicholas's book, how difficult Irish history was in these contexts, I wouldn't have made the suggestion.
Yes. Thanks, Steve. I guess that was not a question.
Now, if I might respond to that one. I don't remember the conversation with Steve, but if you read the footnotes, you'll find that as I go through the book, that the inspiration of historiography was to a large degree assisted by colleagues who were within the department, so that Garage McNichols had an O'Donnell lecture on the annals, which I think in the beginning. Steve wrote on Bishop Bale, no less, quite early in your career. That's a fine piece. Garage Tuohy, I cite him and O'Connell and many other things besides. T.P. O'Neill wrote on James Finton Lawler, who I come to fairly late in the book. So that in that sense, there was an interest among the people in the department in historiography. And then later again, when Neil O'Keefe came, I quote Neil on several footnotes. So that in that sense, there was an interest in historiography, even though no formal teaching or little formal teaching of historiography as having an isolated course.
See,
rather than just teaching historiography within
I don't want to delay Daniel ending, but you know, historiography takes the form of three things. Sometimes. One is the kind of review of the literature anybody has done. Let's imagine the dreary thing of the debate on the gentry. Secondly, it takes the form of understanding how historical ideas develop. I mean, in other words, where did Elton come from, or where does Namur come from, or where does Treitschke come from? And then thirdly, there's the historiography of theory that comes by and large from theorists of it. And I think that debate needs to be further engaged. Back in the 1950s, all the philosophers were telling us historians how history worked. I mean, do you know what I mean? Morris Mandelbaum, oh my God. And even Arthur Danto, and loads of them were doing it. And they never did any history at all. All the philosophers were doing it. And now in the late 20th century, there were elites, begging your pardon, like Dominic Le Capra, and I mean, not Hayden White, who does both, but loads of lists who are telling us how history is done as well. And they don't do any history. But on the other side, there are these rebarbative empiricist historians who say, we have no time with Mandelbaum, with no time with William Walsh or whoever he was, and they never think about it at all. And that gap, that dialogue between the death is still there. I mean, and some of the best lit crits on Hayden White is an exception to this because he can do this. They still don't do history. Can I ask you that?
Oh my God. Yeah, that's such a rich theme to approach.
That's the idea.
I think all of us are opportunists. So I think people in English literature, and I don't know if Marie-Louise would agree with you, we use history opportunistically because that's what you do. I think conversely, historians use literature opportunistically. So there is a ground.
I know, I disagree with that.
That I think is worthwhile. I mean, theory has been a kind of no-fly zone for historians, and it's been a little bit exaggerated in Ireland, I would say, but that would be true on the literary side as well. And it's partly, and I do want to make this point, there's something remarkable about history in Ireland. History is available. I mean that in a particular sense. It's not that it's uncontested. It's not that we don't dispute this, that there are different versions, but in some meaningful sense, it's available. It's a topic that we can encounter and we can argue about. And that's not true everywhere. And the US is a rather extreme example where there just isn't any coherence to it. There's a kind of parodic version of something which we call history for convenience. So there's something to this. The availability of history has made slightly the need to theorize it and approaches less insistent in a certain kind of way, but it almost has a virtue as well as the defect.
There you go.
Well, it's very interesting that although we've had loads of general theorists about history, there hasn't been a theorist about Irish history. I mean, there has been, debate about revisionism and all that stuff, but it hasn't been theoretically informed. What's really interesting is that most of the theorists of history speak in terms of, as it were, continental history or universal history, but not. There hasn't been a theory of Irish history apart from combative, anti-revision and post-revision.
Thank you. I'm afraid time is up.
I'm glad to start that.
And so we're going to take a break. It's going to be, I think, something just outside. And we're going to reconvene in about 15 minutes or so for the actual launch of Nicholas. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you very much. We'll take a big, I do want to give some thanks. I want to thank David Kelly, who's been here testing this new system. We have people joining us online. I'm grateful for them joining. Ravana O'Donoghue, who's organized this event, and of course to Martha Shaughnessy, who worked so closely with Nicholas, who was the founding director of the Moore Institute. So this is a very special occasion for us as a whole. I also want, we have flyers for the book, the discounts, we'll bear that in mind. And I also want to thank the colleagues in history. This is the normal time of the history Wednesday seminar at 4 p.m. There's an extraordinary support for this. It's also part of that sense of the importance, the sense that we're doing something that is meaningful and relevant and that we're attached to. So thank you also for being here. So we'll resume in a few moments. Convene. We're going to reconvene. Yeah, exactly. Mesdames et messieurs. Best of order, as they say in the darts. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you again for being here for this special occasion. We're now moving on to the formal launch part of the event. I'm absolutely delighted that Professor Jane Ohlmeyer is here to do the honors. Jane is the Erasmus Smith Professor of History at Trinity. She has been chair of the Irish Research Council and done noble work in that capacity and in so many other areas of showing kind of visionary relationship to the possibilities for research in the humanities and not merely in history. So I can't think of a better person and somebody who knows Nicholas of old and is an early modernist herself. So Jane, over to you, and we're looking forward to your remarks. So Jane Ohlmeyer.
Thanks. Thank you, Dan, for this warm welcome. And I cannot tell you how much of a privilege it is to be here and to launch, you know, this fabulous book by Nicholas. So congratulations, Nicholas. I mean, it really is a tremendous achievement. And I think OUP, as always, have done a really good job with production. I'm actually meeting Catherine Steele on Friday, so I give her a full report, but I'd say, could you ever do something about the price, Catherine? I mean, it's, but it really is fabulous. And just in case I forget, just the promotional piece, obviously there are discounted volumes available. But it's one of those books that we all absolutely must and should read. It's compelling. And we've already heard from our panelists really some of the key themes about it. But for me, what came home so strongly about this book, it's what it tells us about identity formation. In other words, what it means to be Irish, what it meant to be Irish, of the Irish nation in all of its complexities at key moments in the past. I actually haven't read anything that does it as effectively as this book, Nicholas. It really is tremendously powerful. But there's also that wonderful lightness of touch. I think Marie-Louise Coolahan alluded to that. It's a pleasure to read. It's an easy read. It's these wonderful, elegant turns of phrase and this wonderfully insightful, mature reflection. I mean, he just brings some of the most dreary characters alive. I love Miss Hickson. I just think says it all. But there's clearly such colourful personalities, and Nicholas never loses sight of that sense of humanity as well. Of course, the breadth of knowledge on display is just enviable. It's magnificent in the way that he brings this diverse literature together. And I know in the opening preface, he says, well, there's no manuscript sources here and it's only printed work. Nicholas, I mean, it's phenomenal and it's hugely original. But of course, it's exactly what we've come to expect from you. That intellectual sparkle that you bring to whatever you do. And I was very struck by reading the final conclusion in the final chapter, where you mention 3 historians who, in your opinion, and I completely agree with you, really changed the face of Irish history in the late 20th century. They were, of course, Hugh Carney, Aidan Clark, D.B. Quinn, sadly all passed. But there was one name that was missing. And you know what, Nicholas, it's your own. And I know that you're a very humble person, but actually your name should be there as well. I actually think that the contribution that you've made is, when we say this word pioneering, it's overused. But not here. I mean, the work has been groundbreaking. And I was so glad Ciaran Brady mentioned the whole comparative dimension. But of course, it's much more than that. There wasn't time to go into it. So on the one hand, you've got this chronological breadth over, really 3 centuries that really is quite exceptional. I was reflecting on all of Nicholas's books, what's my favorite? And the problem is that I've got too many favorites. I absolutely love the Upstart Earl, the study of Boyle, Earl of Cork. I mean, it really was such a pioneering book in its day. Obviously, Making Ireland British is an incredible tome, your magnus opus. And now we have another phenomenal work. I think when it comes to Irish history, if we're being brutally honest, there are very few Irish historians who are truly known on the world stage. And Nicholas is really one of them. The contribution that he has made to Atlantic history, and I'm actually going to say to imperial history as well, because that Oxford History of the British Empire, that series that came out in the late 1990s, it was very much an imperial moment. But actually, we as a community of Irish historians were very reluctant to go near imperial history. But Nicholas wasn't. And I think that obviously there are many issues around this, political issues, but again, that bravery and that determination to actually put Ireland at the heart of so many of these conversations. The history of migration, again, a phenomenal contribution there, and now to historiography as well. I mean, there's nobody quite like you, Nicholas. And the fact that the Renaissance Society of America, I don't know, was it 3 sessions they devoted to you? I mean, I don't know any other historian, never mind Irish historian, who has had that and quite, I mean, totally justified accolade. And it's not just what you have contributed as a historian, it's how you have inspired generations. And I'm going to say of us, because I'm giving our ages away here, Nicholas, but I met you 40 years ago. I was a young graduate student at Trinity, and I was working with Aidan Clark on the Earl of Antrim, and the mention of Hill, Mark earlier, anyway, brought it all back. And I so vividly remember somebody said, oh, it's Nicholas Canny, you better go over and introduce yourself. And of course, I was really, oh my God, it's Nicholas Canny, So I went over, and he was rushing for the Galway train. He was always rushing for the Galway train. And he looked at his watch and he said, Jane, very nice to meet you. I have 5 minutes and you need to tell me why I need to be interested in what you're doing. It was as blatant as that. And it was wonderful though. And it has been the beginning of, as I say, a lifelong friendship. But it's not just the friendship and as a mentor, as a supporter, it's the generosity of spirit. Always willing to share references, but also to say, you need to rethink that, but always extraordinarily respectful, as well as being incredibly supportive. And I know many of us in the room have benefited from that intellectual generosity. And Nicholas, for that, to me, this book is a way of also saying thank you for that. And as Ciaran put it, contribution that you've made to cultural debate. I mean, it's not just in Ireland, it's full stop. Now, before I close, I do want to now shift gear a little bit. And I don't know if President O'Hogarty is still here, but I was so delighted that he actually highlighted your role as an academic leader, because it's so unusual to have academics, scholars who are at the top of their game, who are also willing to sacrifice scholarly endeavor, a book probably in your case, Nicholas, to do, and maybe more, I'm looking at Morwenna here, to take on these major leadership roles, President of the Royal Irish Academy, sitting as a member of the Scientific Board of the European Research Council. Folks, that is one of the dreariest, may sound very sexy, but I mean, the amount of hard slog that goes into that is hard to overstate. I think your role here, though, as VP for Research at Galway was a very significant moment, not just for Galway, but actually for us all across the humanities in Ireland. I had the good fortune of being Nicholas's interlocutor at the Trinity end during one of the PRTLI, the Programme for Research and Third Level Institutions. We've forgotten what that is because it's been so long since it's been a PRTLI call. Anyway, and you would be getting these texts at 6 o'clock in the morning, or I don't know, you never slept, Morwenna. It's like it was, have you done this? Make sure John Hegarty does that. And once you finish with John Hegarty, would you ever have a go at whoever it was? He was like the mastermind pulling the strings that actually allowed the arts, humanities and social sciences to secure 28 million euro that was invested in the humanities and social sciences across the country. And there was a platform called the Humanities Serving Irish Society, again, masterminded by Nicholas. And I know there were many others, including in the room today, who were involved, but it was leadership at a very critical moment, and his position here allowed him to advocate for Galway, all sciences, all disciplines, but never lose sight of the importance of the humanities and social sciences. The other thing is, I just loved the way he dealt with, I'll be unkind here, bean counters and administrators who were overly obsessed with restructuring and strategic plans. Nicholas was having none of it. It was just let's focus on what really matters. And it was funny, Trinity launched its first strategic plan around this time. And I always remember John Hegarty and Nicholas were the Provost of Trinity were very like-minded, because John Hegarty had just launched Trinity's strategic plan. And I said, oh, John, congratulations. He was just like, he says, you know, Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King, they had a vision, Jane, not a strategic plan. And for me, it said it all about what a university and what university leadership should be about. They should be about vision, and Nicholas had that in spades. Here we are in the Moore Institute. My God, Nicholas, what have you achieved here? In terms of Galway's global reputation, it has just been tremendous. And obviously continuing this excellence in the humanities and social sciences here at Galway is the only way that we can properly honour what you're doing. But it's not just about Galway, it's actually about Ireland, because we're such a small country that we need strong humanities across the entire country. And this brings me, I have to say something about the current restructuring of the research ecosystems, and I don't mean to put a damper on the evening, but we're about to go into a very significant moment when the whole research landscape, that ecosystem, is being reimagined and recalibrated. And I feel that it is critical that we as a community of arts, humanities and social scientists are very clear about what we need and what we want. And in many ways, this goes back to the original vision that Nicholas would have articulated during his time as VP here in the early 21st century, but it's really about the importance of investing in basic frontier research across all disciplines, all career stages, and not being seduced by challenge-based research. I do it, we all do it, but that is not actually going to solve the world's problems. If you don't have strong disciplines, you'll never have strong interdisciplinarity. He got that, and Galway listened, and as a result, so did the other universities. The final thing, though, just on the restructuring, I think we have to look at governance very closely here. The truth is, we cannot have a research council in Ireland without, if you want, the best academics and scholars being in a majority in terms of governance. In other words, we need to make sure that whatever funding council comes out, it's populated with people of this caliber. So I'm not going to say anything else about the restructuring, but I do think it's 2023, it's coming up, and it's incumbent on every single person in this room to actually articulate. And having Dan here as chair of the council gives certainly me great comfort. And I think he's very well placed, but it's not fair. He can't do it on his own. We have to weigh in behind him. So I'm going to sound like a politician, Nicholas, which means it's time to stop. But the only other time I've heard this done very effectively, I just want to go back to the Cambridge History of Ireland, which was 2018. I think you mentioned it a moment ago, Dan. We launched that in 3 separate venues, and many of you are contributors to the Cambridge History, and Nicholas did an absolutely cracking concluding chapter, again, very much in this historiographical moment. Anyway, Michael D. Higgins launched the volume in Dublin Castle. This was in 2018. And on that occasion, he launched the volume, but he used it as an opportunity to lambast the government. That the threat was to the junior cert, would history be dropped from the junior cert. All of a sudden, history was back on the junior cert. So, you know, these sorts of opportunities should never be missed. But it wasn't just that Michael D. and what he said that night in Dublin Castle. When we launched it in London, John Major launched it there, and he used it as an opportunity to lambast the Brexiteers. That didn't make any difference, but we all felt better. And then Joe Biden launched it in Washington and used the launch as an opportunity then to lambast Trump's migration policies. So I think it's you know, history can make a difference. And I think we should feel very confident in how we go and navigate these extraordinarily troubled waters. And in the person of Nicholas and the example of Nicholas, we've got somebody to whom we can aspire. I know I want to be Nicholas Canny when I grow up. I'm sure others in the room do. And I suppose it just to formally say it, Nicholas, it gives me such pleasure. It's a real privilege to formally launched this wonderful, wonderful book, Imagining Ireland's Past. I want to see the next volume. We really do. You know, this is, I think there's volume 2 is in the making here. But on that note, congratulations.
Any remarks at this stage at the end of our event?
Yeah, well, I think you've been here all day, and there's been altogether too much said about me rather than about the book. I shan't talk about the political aspects of what Jane had said, and that in my initial response to the critique that we had earlier, I spoke about the question of origin and defining who you are. And that by definition is problematic, because when you define who you are, then you are excluding other people. But the other aspect that I treat in the book, and I think it was Bernadette that really dealt with that, it is the question of memory and how memory of what you have suffered is sustained over time. And that again, one of the unique characteristics of Irish history, and which was touched upon by David Hume at the end of the 18th century, and was then touched upon by, more than touched upon by Froude at the end of the 19th century. It's the extent to which, I mean, Hume essentially is talking about the uniqueness of England, a diverse society which has come into being as in the aftermath of a sequence of conquests, but nonetheless they had succeeded in uniting themselves about a single ideology which had been defined at the end of the 17th century about liberty. Whereas in the case of Ireland, that this didn't happen. And that the explanation that Froude offers, that none of the conquests, all of which he approved of, had been sufficiently comprehensive, so that the people forgot their historical pasts and forgot their memories. So that in that sense, the memory element, which to a great degree I've treated in the Gaelic literature that Bernadette mentioned, that by definition it has to be suppressed because it is the memory of the defeated people who for the most part are operating without benefit of the printed word. But nonetheless, I think nobody mentioned methodology in this. I'm no great person in methodology, but one of the factors that I have identified is the interaction between the what might be regarded as this oral culture insofar as Gaelic versus oral. It is partially oral, but it is also manuscript transmitted. But the relationship between that and the printed literature, particularly the printed literature in Latin that had been composed in continental Europe, the extent to which these Latin texts, the arguments in the Latin text were translated into the Irish language and transmitted in verse, I think indicates a close interrelationship between Catholic clergy who had been educated in the continent and became familiar with these Latin texts and the extent to which they were using that in their verse forms in Irish. I think that is a kind of a unique characteristic of the Irish experience, which I think explains the survival of this memory of great past that have been lost, that created such a problem for James Anthony Froude, who, by the way, greatly admired. I really was interested in Froude. I found him incredibly stimulating. I'm not suggesting you should all have your undergraduates read Froude, but and equally well, Miss Hickson. I found her a fascinating author. And a wonderful imagination, because if you want to have imagining Ireland's past, then nobody had a better imagination than me. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Dan for arranging the event. Thanks to the president for introducing the event. And thanks to the panelists for coming all the way to Galway. And thank you all for being here and staying till.
I want to thank our online audience, which has joined us. We had quite a few people there. And again, David, for looking after this. This was our first run through with this new technology in the room, which we're delighted with. So again, thanks everybody. And thanks to people online for joining us.